the perception of people in the region, both in North Africa as well as the Middle East, of the US and its allies have been decreasing. So they've seen it in an unfavorable light, both in terms of their economic impact, in terms of their political impact, in terms of their respect to international law and human rights, etc. And then we've seen an improvement in the perspectives on Iran and on China and on Russia.
The aftershocks of the war in Iran continue to reverberate. The shock to oil and energy supplies has yet to fully impact. There will also be an increase in overall costs caused by shortages of oil and disruptions in supplies of everything from aluminum to fertilizer precursors. This will raise prices for ordinary people everywhere, and it's not just about numbers. We're talking about setting back the dreams and aspirations of billions of people across the globe. I'm Borzu Dergahi, founder of the Badlands newsletter and podcast. Please subscribe at borzou.substack.com. That's Borzou. I'm joined today by Sahar Meshmesh. She is the Inclusive Economies Manager at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. It's a left-leaning think tank. Sahar, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So I guess the first question that I have for you is just overall and in general, are we seeing anything yet? Is there any impact yet in terms of the economic blowback, so to speak, of this war? Are people queuing up for inordinately long gas lines? Are prices already going up in places that you monitor, such as Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, etc.?
The shock of this conflict has already put a strain on public financing. We haven't seen that strain move into the citizens' daily lives yet, and that's because in a lot of countries such as Tunisia or Egypt, there are still subsidies on energy, for example, that kind of cushion the shock, but then it's the state and the country and the government that has to put on the cost of that increase in value between the domestic price of oil and the international price. And we've seen the cost of that during the Russia-Ukraine war, for example, where these countries have gone into economic crises that necessitated a huge bailout for Egypt in the tens of billions of dollars, and in the case of Tunisia has been met with a strangling of imports that have caused a lot of shortages in things like medicine and food, etc. So it might be a little early to see it reflected in the daily life of citizens, but we can already expect what the impact will be both on the citizens as well as the economic situations of the respected governments of different countries in the region. And of course, on the Gulf countries, we can expect this crisis to hit them hard in terms of both their revenues. So we're going to see Gulf countries such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE who have been dragged into this conflict. We expect them to see lower growth. We expect them to see less of resources coming from their oil operations, etc. And we expect them to actually increase their revenue, their spending, both in terms of the reconstruction that needs to happen for their oil operations, but also we can expect them to be investing heavily in military spending because they've learned that the US is not a reliable ally in terms of the security situation and will drag them into conflict where they have no interest being dragged. And that, of course, is going to impact some of the operations in the region where the US and Europe expect the Gulf to come in with money. It's not going to be there. So when we talk about reconstruction in Lebanon or in Syria or in Gaza, the assumption is that the US and its allies will stabilize the country politically, and then the Gulf is going to come in with a lot of money to finance those reconstruction. With this current conflict, will that money materialize? We don't know. And to what level it will materialize, we also don't know. And that puts the stability of all of these countries at risk as well.
So I guess if we can, let's discuss a little bit just what the situation in these countries has been even before the conflict. Things weren't so great in places like, Tunisia, Iraq, Egypt, etc. These weren't exactly thriving economies, or were they? Were they improving before this conflict?
So in Tunisia specifically, Tunisia has been dealing with chronic problems in its economy since the revolution, so for over a decade and a half now. And that includes high inflation, very slow growth, and increased borrowing over the
Mm.
years. And then since the 2023, when Tunisia eventually stopped negotiating with the IMF for a loan and wanted to rely on domestic resources, it's pulled a lot from domestic borrowing. So that is commercial banks, but also we've seen some risky borrowing from the central bank directly at 0% interest rate. And that is a risky behavior in terms of if that borrowing does not materialize in growth, then you're basically printing money and not really doing anything. And of course, you already have high inflation, so that could contribute to that as well. However, we've seen Tunisia kind of manage inflation actually in the last few years, and that honestly comes mostly from external factors. So it had good rainfalls, meaning a good
Mm.
agricultural season, and a lot of exports are agricultural. We've seen that energy prices have remained somewhat low in the last few years, and now that has changed. So because it's an energy importing country, it's been able to foot that bill at a better price. And we've seen more remittances from Tunisians abroad, as well as good tourist season. But those are all very fragile contexts. So energy, as we've seen, can change in a day. Tourism, we'll see how the current impact in inflation globally would affect the decisions of people to go on vacation or not. Rainfall is also very unreliable. So with all of those factors changing, will Tunisia be able to maintain the little progress that it had made in the last 2 years? We're not sure. Egypt is even more volatile. So we've seen that Egypt has a boom and bust cycle in terms of its economy. So it has growth, and then there's a crisis, and hot money leaves Egypt, leaving it without reserves, and the government has to devalue the currency, leading to high inflation in the 30%, etc. Um, and with this current crisis, inflation prospects for Egypt are expected to increase. So, for the IMF's World Economic Outlook, for example, expects that inflation in Egypt is going to increase and its borrowing is also going to increase. So, from 6.5% for the borrowing in 2025 to 12.1% in 2026. So, um, double the borrowing that it did in the previous year. So all of that, and this time the Egyptian government has improved its dealing with the crisis in that it allowed its currency to gradually devalue with the exit of hot money, meaning that it wasn't subsidizing that, which is good. And we haven't seen, because of that deterrent in terms of if you pull your money now, you're going to get less for it. We haven't seen the massive exodus of hot money that we've seen in previous crises in Egypt. But to what extent this crisis is going to impact inflation, impact the government borrowing, etc. And with its IMF program coming to a close in October, we'll see whether or not the government is able to handle that and whether or not it'll go back to the IMF again for another program.
Could you give me an idea of just how the people and the governments of the North Africa, of the kind of struggling North African countries, and I guess all of them are kind of struggling at this point, some less than others, how they view this war? Do they see this as something that was necessary? Do they blame the Iranians, blame the Israelis, blame the Americans for this conflict? What kind of political impact is it having?
The results of the Arab Barometer that is published yearly kind of speaks for itself in terms of the shifting perspectives from the Arab world on countries, including the EU, including the US, and Iran, etc. And what we've seen in the trend is since October 7th, to be honest, the perception of people in the region, both in North Africa as well as the Middle East, of the US and its allies have been decreasing. So they've seen it in an unfavorable light, both in terms of their economic impact, in terms of their political impact, in terms of their respect to international law and human rights, etc. And then we've seen an improvement in the perspectives on Iran and on China and not on Russia. So people in the Arab world are seeing those countries in a better light. And it's not because we've seen those countries improve their position on human rights or anything like that, but rather because we've seen such a deterioration in those concepts in the West specifically. So what we've seen is that the U.S. actions in Iran and in Lebanon and in Palestine have had real consequences on people's perceptions of it, even in countries that are supposedly allied with it. So that puts a lot of the long-term interests of the U.S. at risk, and the government right now, the administration needs to weigh: is this current conflict the cost of this current conflict would outweigh its benefit in terms of the long-term reputation and support for U.S. Government actions from the region.
Sahar, you're really good at citing the numbers, but is there any kind of anecdotal thing that you've seen that shows? Is there any? Maybe think about it for a minute. Is there any kind of anecdotal thing that you've seen that shows declining or shifting perceptions on the U.S. and the West because of not just this ongoing war, but the Lebanon issue, the Lebanon debacle, and the Gaza ongoing Gaza crisis?
Yeah, I think we've seen in Tunisia, for example, there have been protests, both in the Habib Bourguiba street, which is the
Mm.
main street where the revolution happened, but also in front of the U.S. embassy. Those protests have been there since 2023, but have picked up in the last few months as a result of this expansion of conflict in the region. And on the other hand, we've seen moves from the government to kind of downplay these protests, as well as arrests, for example, for the activist with the Samud flotilla, who we've
Mm.
seen last summer go from Tunisia to Gaza with activists. And we've seen the organizers of that in the Tunisian side be arrested in the last few weeks in pre-trial detention now, but on charges of financial crimes that we haven't seen any proof for. And this is largely because these activists have been more active on the domestic front in terms of demanding statements from the Tunisian government that denounce those conflicts, as well as that they were coordinating with the second Samud flotilla, which we've seen in the last few weeks being organized, and the Tunisian authorities basically revoking licenses or
Mm.
preventing that Samud flotilla from going through Tunisia. So in terms of domestic response, we've seen both the population act in a way that demanded more from the government in terms of denouncing this conflict,
Mm.
and the government on the other side have been reluctant to do so, and in some cases aggressively trying to downplay the dynamics on the ground.
Why? Why won't the government put, if you could put on your political scientist hat for a second? I know you're an economist, but why won't the government back the people? What's the loss for the Tunisian government to vocally support the Sumud flotilla or to support, for example, the people's opposition to the Iran war?
Um, I There hasn't been enough statements from the government to truly get a sense of their rationale behind this. For example, they did put out a statement saying that we denounce the war happening, but they haven't really explicitly mentioned the US or Israel or Iran. They've just been calling for a cease to the hostilities. But if I were to guess on some of the reasons behind it is we've seen Tunisia attacked in the last Samud flotilla. So we've seen two drone attacks on
Sure.
the Samud boats when they were docked in Tunisia. And the government first said that the first one was a fire, a life vest catching on fire. And then the second one, they said, we don't know the source of the attack, but the large assumption is that it was Israel backed drones that have attacked those boats. And my guess is that the Tunisian authorities don't want to bring that conflict closer to home. And maybe there are some pressures on it from other actors to kind of stay neutral on the situation.
Yeah,
Again, these are guesses. We don't know enough to
sure.
really comment on government
I can
sentiment
comment.
or
I
reasoning
can
behind this.
comment, and I
Yeah.
can say that I think part of it is probably because Tunisia gets quite a bit of political economic support from the Gulf states. The Gulf states are involved in the conflict, especially the UAE, and the UAE and its propaganda platform, Sky News Arabia, are very much have a very specific view on the war, and they probably would not look too kindly if Tunisia were to support the popular opinion of supporting the Iran war because they are kind of siding with the US and Israel. What about this issue, the major problems in Gaza and now Lebanon, these war ravaged parts of the world in dire need of reconstruction aid, international aid? What impact do you think this will have on reconstruction in those two areas?
The assumption for these reconstructions is that the US and its allies are going to stabilize things from a security perspective, and then the Gulf is going to come in with the funds, or at least a large portion of the funds needed to for reconstruction. And we've seen that, for example, in 2006 with Lebanon. But to what extent, with this current conflict, with the economic hit that Gulf countries have had, would these funds materialize? That is now the question. So the UAE, the Qatar is expected to have more than an 8% shrinkage in its
Mm.
economy. They are expected to be spending more on the military. They're expected to be harder hit in terms of revenues for oil. But will they have the same commitment to stabilize the region and do the reconstruction that we've had before? I'm not entirely sure. And also, even getting to the number in terms of what is needed is increasingly hard. So for Lebanon, the World Bank has tried to estimate the damages from the 2024 conflict. But when we spoke to them, they said, "Oh, we don't have exact numbers for the south for part of the south because Israeli presence is still there." And then when we talked to them, when they said the project is launching, they said, "We're waiting on a lot of things. We're waiting for the Israeli green light to get those tractors and like the rebuilding material there." So I think there are two questions. One is, will we get the money for the reconstruction? And that's a big question to ask. And the second, if even we get the money, will the reconstruction actually happen with the expansion of Israel into Lebanon, with its presence still in Gaza, with a potential spillover into Syria? So whether or not the reconstruction will take place is also something that needs to be centered in the conversation.
Reconstruction aside, how dependent is the more developing part of the Arab world on the Gulf for just regular investment in agriculture, in industry, etc.?
Here, I think Egypt could be a really good example in terms of the dependency on a lot of the more fragile markets on Gulf assistance. So we've seen in 2024 that after the crisis in Egypt, the UAE had to come in with billions of dollars for the Ras Al Hikma deal in order to uh, face some of Egypt's economic problems, especially on the reserve side. So if this current crisis had the same impact on terms of public finance in terms of the monetary position of Egypt, will the UAE step in again with around 7% of its GDP? I don't think that's going to happen.
Mm.
But if the UAE is not going to step in, then who is? And even in terms of the size, it's unlikely to happen from the UAE, but also from a political perspective, it's unlikely to happen as well because the UAE is very miffed with Egypt's current position on the war. It has open channels with the Iranians in order
Mm.
to get the Saudis to talk with them, and because of the regional rivalry between the UAE and Saudi Arabia that has increased in the last few months. Now, Egypt is seen as siding more with the Saudis than it is with the UAE. And we've seen Egypt and the UAE clash on the Sudan question as well, with the Egypt supporting the South and then the UAE
Egypt.
supporting the RSF.
The
Okay, with
SAF
this
is
new
just for
positioning,
listeners. She's referring to the Sudanese armed forces versus the Janjaweed militias that the UAE was supporting in that conflict, in that genocidal civil war in Sudan.
yes. So with this question of um, if Egypt, again, which is a big country and has huge geopolitical implications in terms of its economic position, if it was to have a crisis again because of the current conflict, then who is going to stabilize it? And with the European Union and the US cutting so much of their ODA, so their international aid to countries, what is going to happen? We're not entirely sure, but the perspectives is that Egypt is not going to find the same support, financial support that it found previously in all of its crises, and it needs to all the more reason for it to actually address the structural reforms that it needs to in terms of the military's role in the economy, in terms of the military not paying its taxes, in terms of increasing social spending in order to actually have sustainable growth, etc. So we found that for the region specifically, now it is more urgent than ever for countries to build their economic buffers, build their economic growth factors, and address the structural issues, the banking sector in Lebanon, the military in Egypt, the monopolies in Tunisia, all need to be addressed now. As well as some strategic sectors. So when we talk about the war, we're talking about fertilizers, and we've seen the food security question come up in the Russia-Ukraine war, for example, with the wheat imports that countries such as Egypt and Tunisia are so heavily dependent on. And then we've seen shortages in those key products. And now we're looking at a crisis in fertilizer, which again is going to threaten food security in those countries. So these
Didn't
countries
they
need to
make
be thinking
they
about.
didn't make any provisions. They didn't make any provisions from the Ukraine war. They didn't take any steps to prevent something like that from happening again, a food shortage, any kind of stockpiling or anything like that.
Some countries do have strategic stockpiles and others haven't, but we will see to what extent those who did have provisions, those provisions are adequate in absorbing the shock. And for countries such as Tunisia, for example, we haven't seen any statements around strategic stockpiles of fertilizer or other issues, and we haven't seen any kind of reforms or strategies that do deal with the question of food security and food sovereignty in a more comprehensive manner. So even those with strategic stockpiles, is that stockpile part of a larger strategy that addresses all of the risk factors that exist within the agricultural sector and are related to food security, or is it a one kind of an ad hoc reaction to something that happened and doesn't really fit into a better vision of what do we want our agriculture to be, what do we want our diets to be, what are our risks both domestically and externally in terms of the climate question, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of our access to foreign currency, etc. We haven't seen that conversation really happen in the region in a structural and systematic way.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you also, you're in Tunis now. You were just in Washington for a conference, I believe it was, on reforming the IMF and I presume the World Bank, these Bretton Woods institutions that were set up after World War II to stabilize the global economy and so on. What do you think? Come on, let's be honest. Are these institutions even reformable? Do they do more harm than good? I know they're trying to change their ways. I know they're trying to get input from people like economists in developing countries, and not just listening to the same old people in Paris and London and New York. Well, what do you think? Like, honest opinion, is there any kind of hope for these institutions to actually help versus becoming instruments for the U.S. policy, essentially?
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen them be instrumentalized and weaponized in some cases. So, for example, for Egypt or Argentina, is that debt actually sustainable enough for the IMF to be lending to those countries? That's a big question that we have not had a definitive answer to. But in terms of progress within the institutions themselves, on the IMF side, we've seen them come up with better surveillance advice. So, for those maybe unfamiliar with the IMF, basically they have one part of their work looking at countries even outside of programs like lending programs to see what can we do to improve the economy. And then they have the lending programs that is linked to conditionalities. And we've seen progress on the surveillance side in terms of the fund saying more progressive
What do you mean by the
taxation is better
surveillance
than
side?
rigor.
Could you unpack that term, the
Yeah.
surveillance side?
So yeah. So whether or not you have a program, you can ask the fund to assess your current policies and your current economy and come up with policy recommendations in terms of how to
Hmm.
better mobilize resources and how to better streamline your spending and how to better your banking sector, for example. And then on the lending side, you have programs where the disbursement of the tranche of the loan depends on whether or not you meet conditionalities. So surveillance is just suggestions. And then on the loaning side, you have to meet those conditionalities in order to get the money. So on the more flexible voluntary side of the advice, we've seen them argue for better taxation through
Hmm.
progressive policies such as income taxes, wealth taxes, etc., and say that regressive taxes such as the value-added tax, etc., are harmful to growth and are harmful to the economic growth and future of a country. But then you find that on the loaning side, they're still very much in that austerity mindset of you need to cut spending, including on social sectors as well as capital investment in infrastructure. We've seen them argue for regressive taxation, such as value-added tax, which we know harms low-income families more so than high-income households. So what we've been making as an argument for them is that you need to be more coherent in that you need the progressive policies that exist in your surveillance to also be reflected in your programs, because we know at the end of the day it's the programs, it's the loaning side that has more power, that is able to better impact the economic policies than the suggestion side of the surveillance. On the World Bank, we've seen it come up with a fragile and conflict and violence strategy or a refreshed strategy, but we've found that the focus is entirely um, beyond the realities on the ground.
What do you
So
mean?
the focus of this strategy is on job creation and private sector rebuilding, which is very important to have a long-term sustainable economy. But in a fragile setting, that is not the priority. The priority should be on social protection. The priority should be on reconstruction. The priority should be on
So
the
wait,
dynamics of the
just
conflict. Yes.
fragile situations. You mean like immediate post-conflict situations?
Yes. So they're looking at conflict and post-conflict setting and how the World Bank can work better in those settings
Sure.
through its project in
So
order
like
to,
they should be setting up like little clinics and little facilities for food and so on, and they're already zooming ahead to like job
yeah.
creation and promoting private sector growth.
Yes, which we know in a post-conflict setting could take years, if not decades. Meanwhile, we know that there are spoiler actors that will take that opportunity of the government trying to focus on job creation to at the expense of social protection and social spending to say, look, the government is not able to meet your needs. Come support our side of the conflict. Or in Lebanon's case, we've seen spoiler actors provide those services themselves and say, we are able to give you hospitals, give you education, provide you with social protection, whereas the government is unable to do so. And then that government lack of spending is actually celebrated on the IMF and the World Bank side of saying, well, you have a budget surplus, so this is good in terms of your macroeconomic positioning, but vis-a-vis the population, it just says that whatever post-conflict context led by the authorities is not going to be beneficial to the population. And that is not addressed by the IMF or the World Bank substantively in these post-conflict settings. And we've seen it in Syria. Even though Syria is now only 1 year post-conflict, the government has slashed subsidies. They have slashed both to food and electricity. We've seen a housing crisis come up, especially in Damascus, where most of the new jobs are being created. And the government in the last year has actually had a small surplus in the budget, meaning that it did have resources, but it didn't invest any of those resources in providing services such as healthcare and education and housing support, or in terms of starting reconstruction. And we're wondering, what kind of message does that send to a population coming out of a conflict and seeing the government collect resources but decide not to spend them on the population?
Sahar, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. It's been really great to talk to you. Very informative. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. Again, this is Borzu Dergahi. This is the Badlands podcast. You can subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Please hit the like button and subscribe. You can find me at Borzou, BORZOU.substack.com. Thanks a lot.